I want to ask you something. When was the last time you ate something that felt kind of healthy? You know, a salad from Pret, a wrap, something from the coffee shop that felt like the sensible choice. And then an hour or two later, found it almost impossible to concentrate. No, you weren't tired before you ate and you're not particularly stressed, but your brain has just gone somewhere else entirely. You know, you feel slow, you feel foggy and flat. And if someone asked you what caused it, you probably wouldn't really know. You might blame the time of day or your workload, or you might even blame spending too much time on your phone. But I want to suggest something different. I think it could have been your lunch. I'm Gavin Evers, a strength conditioning and rehabilitation coach and cognitive performance specialist. And today I want to talk about something that I think is affecting how almost everyone in a demanding job thinks, decides and performs every single day. And most people have absolutely no idea it's even happening. So here's what most people believe about sugar. It's bad for you. It makes you put on weight. It's not great for your teeth. You know, too much of it can cause diabetes. But if you're not eating sweets and loads of fizzy drinks in large quantities, then you're probably fine. Now that is a conversation that most of us are having about sugar, right? But it's missing the most important part entirely, because sugar isn't primarily a weight problem. It's a brain problem. And the sugar causing the problem is almost certainly not what you think it is. Now, let me tell you something that might change the way you think about your lunch. In 2020, an Irish court ruled that Subway's bread couldn't legally be classified as bread because it turned out that the sugar content was more than 5 times the legal limit for bread under Irish law. So a 6-inch sub roll contained more sugar than a milk chocolate digestive biscuit. Now, I'm not particularly interested in calling Subway out. What I'm interested in is what that case illustrates. And we've been working under the assumption that savoury food doesn't contain that much sugar. You know, that a chicken wrap is a sensible lunch, that a flavoured coffee is just coffee with a bit of extra flavour. You know, the granola that you're having for breakfast is the healthy alternative to cereal. But a standard flavoured syrup in a high street coffee shop, you know, the kind that you probably don't even really think about before you order, that can add somewhere between 20 and 40 grams of sugar to a drink that most people aren't even counting as food. You know, that's close to an adult's entire recommended daily intake in a drink before 9 a.m. probably. And the bread in many supermarket sandwiches contains added sugar as part of the recipe. You know, the sauces contain it, the low-fat yogurt that people are eating thinking that it's a healthy, good option. That often contains more sugar than a chocolate bar, because when you take out the fat, something has to replace the flavour. Now, I'm not saying this to alarm you, and I'm definitely not telling you to never eat a wrap or have one of those flavoured drinks if that's your thing. I'm saying that most people are consuming significantly more sugar than they think they are, from sources that they would probably never really consider a problem. And the thing is, if you don't know it's there, you can't understand what it's doing to you. Let me explain what's actually happening, because the mechanism here, it matters. So your brain is extraordinarily glucose dependent, unlike your muscles. You know, it has no or almost no capacity to store energy. So it relies on a continuous, stable supply of glucose from the bloodstream, from your bloodstream to function. And the key word there is stable. When you eat a high sugar meal or anything that breaks down into glucose really quickly, like white bread, pastries, processed snacks, sweetened drinks, your blood sugar rises rapidly, and your pancreas responds to this by releasing insulin to bring it back down to normal levels. Now, if you're metabolically healthy, that process works really well, you know, but it almost never results in a perfectly smooth landing. You know, blood sugar drops, and it often drops quite sharply. And that drop is when you really feel it. You know, that slowness, the difficulty focusing, the kind of almost physical sense of your brain going offline. That isn't tiredness in a general sense. That is your prefrontal cortex being temporarily starved of the fuel it needs to do its job properly. Now, the prefrontal cortex is the most metabolically expensive part of your brain, and it runs the things that you most rely on for work, for your professional life, like complex reasoning, working memory, decision making, and the ability to hold multiple things in your mind at once. And it is disproportionately sensitive to drops in glucose supply, which means the part of your brain that you depend on the most at work is the first to go when your blood sugar crashes. But here's where it gets a bit more serious, and this is the part I see play out in real people, in real working lives all the time. Now, I've had clients who are fit, capable, sensible about food in any reasonable measure. They come back from a routine health check and they've been told by their doctor that their glucose is creeping up. They're obviously shocked by it because they look after themselves, right? They exercise. It's not like they're eating cake for lunch, and yet there it is, high glucose. Now, there's a condition called insulin resistance that develops silently over years in people who are otherwise healthy. And the cognitive effects begin long before any standard blood test would even catch it. So here's basically how it works, right? Over time, if you consistently push large amounts of sugar into the bloodstream, your cells gradually become less responsive to insulin. So your body compensates by producing more insulin to do the same job. Now, on a standard fasting glucose test, your numbers can look completely normal because your body is working overtime to keep them there, to keep them normal. The research is clear on what's happening in the brain during this process. A longitudinal study in the journal Diabetes found that higher insulin resistance was associated with measurably less grey matter in the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, which are the regions responsible for memory and executive function. And this was in people who were cognitively healthy. So no diagnosis, no symptoms anyone had named, just a brain that was kind of quietly changing in exactly the places that matter most. And this isn't a distant risk. This is the direction your brain is traveling in right now based on the choices that you are possibly making every single day without connecting them to this outcome. And the reason I think that this conversation matters so much is that nobody is having it with the people who need to hear it the most. The driven, capable professionals who had their training sorted, who eat what they would consider to be a reasonable diet, who would never describe themselves as having a sugar problem. This is exactly who I'm talking to today. And there's one more mechanism worth mentioning because it connects to something much bigger and it's really important. Chronically elevated blood sugar, even at levels well below what would be a diabetes diagnosis, drives inflammation. Specifically, it creates a state of low-grade systemic inflammation that crosses the blood-brain barrier. Now, I talked about this a bit in episode 5 in the context of nutrition more broadly, but the specific mechanism here is this. Excess glucose in the bloodstream generates compounds called advanced glycation end products, or let's call them AGEs. Now, that name is worth remembering because they damage blood vessels, they impair cellular function, and they drive inflammatory processes in the brain that are directly linked in the research to accelerated cognitive decline over time. So what can you actually do about this? What can you do right now? So I'm going to give you 3 things. It's not a diet overhaul. It's 3 specific changes that, in my experience, make a meaningful and relatively quick difference to how your brain performs. The first is to look at your breakfast differently. Now, the most common pattern I see is people starting the day with sugar. Things like cereal, toast and jam, a pastry from the coffee shop, or a sweetened yogurt. Now, all of them produce a blood sugar spike within the first hour of the day, which means by mid-morning, before you've done anything particularly demanding, your brain is already in recovery mode. Now, the shift is simple. Prioritize protein at breakfast. Simple as that. Protein at breakfast. Okay, so things like eggs, Greek yogurt but without the fruit jam bit, smoked salmon, anything that gives you a proper base of protein. Because protein slows glucose absorption, it supports more stable blood sugar and provides all the amino acids that you need, or that your brain needs, to produce those neurotransmitters. Now, this one change alone, the protein first at breakfast, is probably the single highest return adjustment that high professionals and anyone can make to their morning cognitive performance. The second is to be skeptical of things that you might consider healthy. The granola, the flavored oat milk latte, the sandwich with the low fat dressing, or that protein bar that is just a chocolate bar but with better PR. These are the sources where sugar is hiding in quantities that really matter, you know, in foods that feel like they're the right choice. Now, I'm not asking you to become obsessive over labels, but I'm asking you to be curious, you know, because once you start looking, you'll be surprised. And once you're surprised, you can make better decisions without it feeling like deprivation. Now, I put a chart in this week's newsletter that compares the sugar content across a lot of these foods that we've just spoken about. Now, the numbers laid out visually are genuinely surprising. So I'd encourage you to click the link below and go and have a look for yourself. And the third thing is to pay attention to what happens after you eat. You know, I don't mean in a clinical logging everything kind of way. Just start noticing, you know, does your ability to concentrate drop in the hour or two after lunch? Is your afternoon performance consistently worse than your morning performance? Does your decision making at 3 p.m. feel different compared to that at 10 a.m.? Because those patterns aren't just random, they're data. And if you start reading them as information about what you ate rather than just kind of facts about your day, you get a level of understanding or a level of knowledge about your own performance that very few people have. Now, that awareness, in my experience, changes behavior more reliably than any advice or meal plan I could give you, because it makes the connection personal, you know, not abstract, not statistical. It's your brain, it's your lunch on your specific Tuesday. Sugar isn't just a weight problem, and it's not just a diabetes problem. Sugar is affecting how you think, how you make decisions, how you process information, and how you consistently your brain performs right now, you know, today, based on what you ate this morning. And the reason most people haven't connected those dots is that nobody told them that they should be looking there. But the good news is that this is one of the most responsive systems in the body. So you don't need months to feel a difference. If you change what you eat in the morning, this week, tomorrow, you'll notice what happens in the hours that follow. And that's where all of this starts. And if you want to understand more about how your daily habits might be affecting your own cognitive performance, I put together a little 3-minute assessment that looks at exactly this, and I'll put the link below. And if this kind of thinking is useful to you, the newsletter is where I go deeper on it every single week. It's practical, evidence-based, no filler, and you can subscribe below. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a good week.